and welcome to this Bible study published by the Judson Road Church of Christ in Longview, Texas. My name is Tyler Sams, and I'll be taking us through this study of Mark chapter 13 as we begin to wrap up this gospel account. So if you have your New Testament with you, I invite you to open up to Mark chapter 13, and let's get started. In verse 1, Mark notes, as he, Jesus, was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, behold what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another which shall not be torn down." So we've noted previously in our studies that Jesus is traveling back and forth from Jerusalem during this last week before his crucifixion. And on this day, some of his disciples point out to him the beautiful stones and the beautiful buildings that comprised the temple compound. And interestingly, perhaps jarringly, Jesus responds about the destruction of the temple. It's kind of a strange moment, especially if we were there as one of the disciples. We're praising this beautiful structure, and then all of a sudden Jesus says, yeah, well, it's all going to come down. And so I think we might explore for just a moment why it is that Jesus would respond in that manner. Perhaps it's because Jesus had just recently cleansed the temple for the second time, the first time being early on in John's gospel account. That this place that was to be a holy place, a place for God's own name, a house of sacrifice, had been perverted into something that it was never intended to be. And while some would look at it outwardly and see beauty, Jesus looked on it inwardly and saw corruption. Maybe it's because that the temple stood as the central figure in the lives of so many people who should have known better but ended up rejecting Jesus. In John chapter 1 and verse 11, Jesus came to his own, but his own did not receive him. And so perhaps for that reason, Jesus responds in this jarring manner. Or maybe, as Matthew notes for us, quoting Jesus, that Jesus is, that he was greater than the temple. We see the disciples struggling over and over again with the reality that Jesus was going to die and Jesus was going to go away. Yet here they are praising the lesser temple. Well, the one who is greater than the temple is going away, and they're struggling with that. And so perhaps to help them grasp the reality of his departure, Jesus speaks to them here about the departure of the temple. Obviously, it gets them thinking, because in verses 3 and 4, Peter and James and John and Andrew come to Jesus on the Mount of Olives privately. And they said, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all of these things are going to be fulfilled?" And so Jesus begins to speak to his disciples here, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, about the fall of Jerusalem. In verse 5, Jesus said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and will mislead many. And you will hear wars and rumors of wars, but do not be frightened. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end." Jesus begins talking about the fall of Jerusalem here by talking about the signs that would precede Jerusalem's fall. You would have these wars and rumors of war in verse 8. You would have earthquakes in various places and famines, and these would be the beginnings of this whole process. There would be trouble for the apostles as they would set about to fulfill the Great Commission to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. In verse 9, "Be on guard, for they will deliver you up to the courts, and you will be flogged in the synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them, and the gospel must first be preached to all nations." And then perhaps the biggest warning sign of them all would be the Roman army surrounding Jerusalem. Or as it's stated in verse 14, "When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be," let the reader understand, "then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Look at two other passages with me very briefly. Look at Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15. We're going to look at two parallel passages. In Matthew chapter 24 and in verse 15, here's how Matthew records Jesus' words. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet," there's new information, "standing in the holy place, Well, over here in Mark 13, it was the abomination of desolation, but no reference to where that's found in Scripture. And then Mark records where it should not be. Well, where should it not be standing, Jesus says in Matthew 24:15, in the holy place? Can we be any more specific? Look at Luke's account of this. Luke chapter 21 and verse 20. Luke chapter 21 and verse 20. Luke gets right to the point. But when you see Jerusalem, there's the holy place. There's where the abomination which makes desolate should not be standing. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by, Matthew and Mark, the abomination which makes desolation, but here Luke, surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand. Who is this abomination which makes desolate? It's the army that would invade and destroy Jerusalem. Of course, we know from history, AD 70, that's the Roman army surrounding Jerusalem and eventually destroying it. And so here are the signs that would precede Jerusalem's fall. And after giving these signs, Jesus warns his listeners to put the pieces together. He says, when you see all of this happening, then verse 14, you need to get out of Dodge. You need to flee Jerusalem. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let him who was on the housetop not go down or enter it to get anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. When you see this happen, when you see the army begin to march and surround Jerusalem, get out of Jerusalem, Jesus says. This is a literal fleeing from a literal city that is complicated by the various circumstances of life. Verse 17, but woe to those who are with child and to those who nurse babes in those days, and pray that it may not happen in the winter. Why? Because that would complicate and make more difficult this process of escape. And then Jesus notes, as you look at verses 21, 22, and 23, the reality that there would be some who would try to be deceptive in this time. But Jesus says, don't listen to them, but rather take my counsel. If anyone, verse 21, says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or behold, he is there, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show signs and wonders in order, if possible, to lead the elect astray. But take heed, behold, I have told you everything in advance. So Jesus has told of the signs that would precede Jerusalem's fall, and that when those signs came to fruition, he has told his hearers what they are to do. And now he talks a little bit more about that judgment that would fall on Jerusalem, and he describes it as a divine judgment. Verses 24 and 25, Jesus uses this apocalyptic language that's so often found in the Old Testament to describe this happening to Jerusalem. In those days, verse 24, after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. This is this divine apocalyptic judgment language that we see on nations throughout the Old Testament. God bringing his judgment down on nations because of their wickedness. And indeed, that's just exactly what we see here. Notice in verse 26, they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. This judgment that would to befall Jerusalem was coming from Jesus, and this judgment was because of their rejection of Jesus. Go back and read Matthew 23, beginning in verse 29 at some point, where Jesus looks over the city of Jerusalem longingly and says, how often I would have gathered you together under my wings as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. And so because of that, Jesus goes on to say, your house is left desolate. Jerusalem was going to fall. And in describing the fall of Jerusalem, Jesus gives a time frame. Beginning in verse 28, learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branches already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. These signs would indicate the nearness of the event. So the earthquakes, the famines, the wars and rumors of wars, the persecution of the apostles, all of this would indicate that this event was drawing near, and indeed it would take place during the time frame of that generation. Verse 30, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things take place. And so Jesus describes this judgment that was going to come upon Jerusalem, this divine judgment that would befall Jerusalem within the time frame of the generation to whom Jesus then spoke. But that's not where the chapter ends. Look at verse 31. Jesus gives a bit of a transition here. Heaven and earth will pass away. Now, we've been talking about Jerusalem being destroyed, but now Jesus broadens the subject. Verse 31, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Jesus has just been giving signs and talking about the time frame for a destruction that would fall on Jerusalem, but now we're talking about a different subject. We're talking about heaven and earth passing away, and passing away at a time that no one knows except for the Father. So Jesus closes here by discussing the time when heaven and earth would pass away. And this really is a lesson for his disciples. Just as they had to be watchful for the day of judgment on Jerusalem, the apostles and us as well need to be watchful for the ultimate day of judgment. Verse 35, therefore be on alert, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening, at midnight, or at cock crowing, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, Jesus says. Be on the alert. Be watchful. Thanks for joining me today in this study of Mark chapter 13. I hope you have a great start to your week, and I look forward to being back with you next Sunday. Take care.